first event of the fall semester for the Institute for Middle East Studies film and lecture series. My name is Mona Atiyah. I'm the director of the Institute, and Shana Marshall, the associate director, will be moderating today's panel. We're really excited to launch a new format for our what was a lecture series, which is really a conversation between two scholars about one of their books. So today we're delighted to be joined by Gökçe Günel, who's assistant professor of anthropology at Rice University. And her research focuses on the social aspects of climate change adaptation projects in the Arabian Peninsula. Following her doctoral work at Cornell, she's been at Rice, Columbia, and the University of Arizona, but currently at Rice. And her articles have been published in numerous journals, including Public Culture, Anthropological Quarterly, Engineering Studies, Yearbook of Comparative Literature, Avery Review, PoLAR, and many others. Of course, today we're going to be discussing her recent book, Spaceship in the Desert, and Deen Sharp, who's holding up the book nicely, is going to be our discussant for today. So he'll be interviewing or interlocutor in conversation with Gökçe. He's an LSE fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science in Geography and the Environment. He was previously a fellow at the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT, and he's the co-director of Terraform Center for Advanced Urban Research. He's the co-editor of two books, Beyond the Square, Urbanism and the Arab Uprisings, and Open Gaza. And he's working on a third one based on his doctoral dissertation, provisionally entitled Capitalizing Urbanization Between the Future and Survival in the Global Middle East. So we're absolutely just delighted to be able to have this event online with Deen in London and Gökçe in Texas. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass the, I guess, a virtual microphone over to Deen to get us started. I believe, Shana, did you want to do a housekeeping item about how we're going to take questions before we start?
Yeah, we're actually going to take questions through the chat. So please enter your question in the chat box, and I will collect a few of those and deliver them to our guests once their Q&A is over, their two-person Q&A.
Great. Well, first, thank you so much, Mona, Shana, and Christian for having us. We're all delighted to be with you and to discuss this wonderful book by Gökçe. And you know, I just wanted to emphasize first just how groundbreaking this book was. You know, the research for this was done at the start of 2010-11, and you know, at that time, to have a book that focuses on, you know, the Gulf through a technological and environmental lens that this work does was very unique. And I think we'll discuss maybe later the kind of flood of literature that's coming now around these subjects. But just to really to forefront that, and I know we want to, Gökçe will just start with the central object of this book, which is Masdar City, and to just illustrate it with some images, because you know, we don't assume that you all know what this district was, and to give some context and just situate the discussion, we thought it would be good to start with that. So, Gökçe, I'll just pass over to you to show these beautiful images.
Well, thank you for your kind words on the book, and yeah, let me just start with sort of like a brief description of what Masdar City was and what it maybe is even. So, okay. We're seeing image of the Masdar City Master Plan, which was heavily publicized in the years between 2007 and 2011. The Master Plan, this image is important because it was part of a project where the Abu Dhabi government started publicizing its intentions to invest in renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the form of a multifaceted state-owned company called Masdar. The reason why Abu Dhabi started out with this initiative is because they hope to ensure that the Emirate remains a significant player in the energy industry well after its oil reserves run dry or become less valuable. So they a big in the energy industry, why not become a big player in the renewable energy and clean technology business beyond, expand our sort of portfolio beyond oil. So in the following years, in the sort of the years, say 2007, 2008, Masdar became widely known for Masdar City, a futuristic smart eco-city that was designed by the London-based architecture office Foster and Partners. And the hope was that Masdar City would rely entirely on renewable energies, and would house 50,000 residents, and it would have 40,000 commuters on a 600-hectare area. And the budget for the project was big. It was going to cost $22 billion. When they started sharing these images, when the Abu Dhabi government and Foster and Partners started sharing these images, Norman Foster, which is who's the founder and the partner of Foster and Partners, said, to look at these computer-generated images, you might think it was a fantasy from a sci-fi comic, but actually Masdar City is a university city, is an environmental technology park, and it's already being built. And the things I should say, I get making other points about the project, is that although the Masdar City aspect of the project was the most widely publicized, Masdar also invested in renewable energy-wise other operations, and these operations were called Masdar Power, Masdar Carbon, and Masdar Capital. And Masdar Institute, which is the Renewable Energy Research Center that was founded by MIT, was opened inside this fledgling eco-city. And it started offering fully funded graduate degrees to about 200 students from around the world in 2010. One second. So here's an image of the Masdar Institute dorms and labs situated at the center of Masdar City. And during the time of my extensive fieldwork in 2010 and 2011, the students who went to Masdar Institute and who lived in the dorms at Masdar City were the only inhabitants of Masdar City. And the Masdar Institute no longer exists. The buildings, as here, this is a very recent photograph of Masdar City. The buildings that you see here on the left side are the old Masdar Institute buildings, but now they've turned into sort of there's a different institute being set up there that's going to mainly be focused on, I think, surveillance technologies and big data issues, etc. And the plan was that the institute was going to start receiving students this year, but I'm not sure exactly what's happening there. But this is just to give you a general overview of how the project started and where it is right now.
Thanks, Gökçe. So, just to be clear that Masdar was proposed as a zero carbon district and now is a special economic zone that, from what I understand, didn't achieve this zero carbon goal. But in the book, you're determined not to frame it as a success or a failure or engage with that debate. Can you just speak to that, like why you were so determined to kind of not engage in that framework, and how you sought to deal with that in the book?
I think that question, I mean, initially when I first went to Masdar City or started talking to people who were responsible for Masdar City in 2008 and 2009, I thought the book was going to be a book about sort of how a project comes undone. Because I've read a lot of examples of these kinds of books, and I thought, okay, this is going to be another book that sort of adds to that kind of lineage of thinking about why and how big projects fail. But that's a fieldwork at Masdar City, and as I engaged with people who were part of the project, I realized that there's actually something else that's happening there for these people. And my goal is to be a good ethnographer and actually do participant observation amongst the people that I'm working with here, and I should actually hear out and see what's important, what matters to them. And from their perspectives, from the perspectives of the students or the faculty members or all the other environmental consultants and professionals who were part of the project, I think there was the issue of sort of what the project could achieve in the future was a lot more important than all its other sort of failures or small successes. So I think I wanted to focus on the idea of potential as I was writing the book, because I thought the project actually much larger sort of ideal from the perspective of the people who were involved in the project. So I think it stood in for the idea that, we're in a world with, we're suffering from a lot of environmental problems. Climate change is, inevitable, and we're also seeing issues around energy scarcity in the different parts of the world. How are we going to counter these issues? If we can achieve a project like Masdar, if we can pull this off the ground, then that means that technological innovation, urban design solutions, and business models can actually stop climate change, can actually stop energy-related issues around the world. So I think there was a sort of an investment in what I call in the book technical adjustments. So these technological solutions or business solutions or design solutions that can actually stop climate change and energy scarcity issues, and that can allow people to live their lives exactly the way they do now. So that's why I think sort of the potential of Masdar City was also stood in amongst my interlocutors as the potential of these kinds of larger technical adjustments that can be found in many different parts of the world that are not necessarily unique to the Abu Dhabi context, but that, took on a different kind of sort of scale or different kind of form in the.
Well, so to hone in on this idea of technical adjustments, which is a central concept that you bring to the book. So just to explain for people, the technical adjustments is what you explain as a wide-ranging response to climate change that your interlocutors provided, that opens up certain interventions, such as extending technological complexity, while foreclosing others, namely the larger scale moral, ethical, and political questions regarding how we live. So, yeah, I mean, I find in some ways technical adjustments, and maybe this is a point of discussion, is a nice way of saying like how technology is used basically to bury these pressing ethical, political, and moral questions, but also, something that you seek to really bring to the forefront in the book. So maybe one answer this question of whether technical adjustments am I correctly understanding it as like this way to mask these questions? And equally, what were the kind of moral, ethical, and political questions that you were bringing up in the book in the context of Masdar?
For instance, you're right. I mean, it is a way of masking larger social, political, and economic issues, for sure. And I mean, the most pressing of these issues, I think, in the context of the Masdar City project, or in the context of was the kinds of class inequalities that were impossible to ignore, but that were ignored while the city was being constructed. And so in the book, I have this section that I've referred to often in these kinds of conversations, where someone from Masdar City actually took me out to see the new solar panel fields that were being put together right outside the sort of the Masdar Institute construction site, and or right outside the Institute campus. And as we were walking around, he said, at Masdar, in Abu Dhabi, we would believe that we would have a lot of, our solar panels would be very efficient, but now we're suffering from a lot of mud and sort of dust on solar panels. But we found a solution for this problem. And he said, we call it a man with a brush. So in this environment where there's a sort of, I actually have an image of this here, one second. One second, I have a lot of different kinds of images. Here we go. And he said, we're having, we can't find a technical solution for this problem, immediate technical solution for this problem, but we've hired all these people who are walking around around the Masdar City site, cleaning solar panels on a daily basis. And in this environment where renewable energy and clean technology innovation is foregrounded so much, of course, it's funny for a lot of people to have the man with a brush be the key node who enables the project to actually function in the way that it's imagined, who enables the solar panels to function the way it's imagined. But at the same time, the man with a brush is never imagined to be part of a community that makes up Masdar City. man with a brush is someone who's actually seen as disposable. And as soon as there's a sort of a technological solution to this problem, the man with a brush will be sent back to South Asia, Southeast Asia, wherever he's from, and eliminated from this context. So this is the kind of imagination that I found often at Masdar City amongst a lot of the sort of the developers of the city, and which is one of the reasons why I call the book a Spaceship in the Desert, is because the analogy of Spaceship in the Desert was seen as pertinent in understanding or explaining what the city stands for. It's a technical, highly technological object that's insulated from the world around it, but it can withstand all kinds of environmental troubles, and it can always sort of sustain itself regardless of what's available in its environment. And so ideas around insulation, isolation, and innovation become really significant. And what gets left outside the spaceship is rarely discussed. So I think that's probably one of the main issues, not only with sort of in mitigating climate change in the Abu Dhabi context, but in the global context, we see these kinds of class boundaries get made and remade throughout all of these conversations. And I think this is, by looking at Masdar City, I was able to, I think, draw out some of these inequalities in a very small scale way. But I think these are things that we need to think about globally.
Absolutely. And, just thinking that this theme through this spaceship in the desert is obviously, in one sense, immediately futuristic, but also at the same time quite dated. And what the wonderful thing about the book is, we're introduced to all of these new technologies, but, through the digging that you do, we soon find that, actually, this is an idea from the 1960s. Oh, no, the energy currency has actually had roots in the 1890s. So could you speak to that point and maybe give us a sense of this question of temporality that runs through the book?
Yeah, thank you. It's a lot of the ideas, as you said, one of the things that I first started doing research on the project in 2008 was one of the developers involved with the project presented it as a Blade Runner. And of course, this received a lot of attention. Everyone said, we don't want to make Blade Runner. We don't want, actually, Blade Runner was a critique of the kind of future humans could one day occupy. And Blade Runner is a dystopia. And while I was listening to this commentary, I thought, but actually, Blade Runner is also very old. It's not necessarily a fresh idea that we're imagining for the future. Beyond all of this political and social problems, beyond this authoritarian, a critique of authoritarianism and of the police force, this is actually an idea from the 60s and then once I started looking at other instances of technological development on site, I realized that, as you said, all of these ideas have actually their roots in various decades. Most prominently, I think the 1960s and 1970s environmental struggles were sort of being kind of played out in the Masdar City project, and I think the idea of the spaceship and the idea of was one of those where the U.S. space program had been quite influential in dictating certain visions of how we should imagine environmentalism in the 60s, and those ideas were being kind of repurposed here as well. So the rapid transit is another idea from that period. I think I have an image of that as well here. Sorry.
Yeah, and this PRT network is also a very Elon Musk kind of and of course Musk is also using a dated idea, but also posing it in futuristic ways, which is interesting.
What's interesting about those is it possible to actually have? This is one of the things that I was wondering as I was writing the book. Is it also what would a fresh idea about the future look like that doesn't necessarily fall back on all these like science fiction stereotypes that we have? Because a lot of the reference, I mean, Blade Runner is one, but many other science fiction films were referenced as I was, interviewing people and doing participant observation amongst people at Masdar City, and now and that's one of the reasons why I think it's sort of there's an aspiration to keep things as they are and not necessarily to reinvent the future and to think about sort of what the sort of the unthinkable. What's the unthinkable into in dealing with climate change or energy scarcity issues or energy issues overall, and that another way I describe the Masdar City project in the book is by calling it a status quo utopia. And so there's a sort of desire to keep social, political, economic relations intact is the way they are, and that's why the boundaries of the spaceship are necessary, because that's the only way in which those kinds of relations can be preserved. And it is, I mean, and the reason a lot of people have asked me, "Oh, is Masdar City a utopia or a dystopia?" And those terms are productive only if you understand whose utopia or whose dystopia these spaces might be. So Masdar City is someone's utopia, of course, or just the same way as Abu Dhabi is someone's utopia. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the sort of the framing it as a status quo utopia helped me understand what's being preserved and what's being sort of left behind in thinking about a project like Masdar City.
Keeping with the theme of temporality, in terms of the now, do we get a sense of if there are still efforts now to at least reduce the carbon footprint of Masdar? Like, do you think it's had an impact in the way Abu Dhabi actually conducts urbanization and its urban fabric, or even beyond the region? Like, has it really forced any thinking around the relationship between carbon, urban form, and our use of energy?
In Abu Dhabi, I think it was definitely sort of generative in thinking about non-oil forms of energy. And one of the things that there are still ongoing solar and wind projects in Abu Dhabi, but right now the most important part of Abu Dhabi's energy portfolio is perhaps the nuclear power plant. And the nuclear power plant is headquartered at the Masdar City site, right next to the International Renewable Energy Agency. And those two institutions are, I think, the most central parts of the sort of the district of Masdar City as it exists today. And sort of the Masdar headquarters and the sort of what used to be the Masdar Institute, although they're built along, following the sort of the Foster Master Plan and sort of the eco-city design principles that were at play in 2006, 2007. I think the IRENA headquarters and the sort of the nuclear sort of energy headquarters are sort of having more of an impact in sort of how on the energy landscape in Abu Dhabi today. And the nuclear, the nuclear energy production has regional consequences. And about in the book, but elsewhere I've written about the electricity grid of the Arabian Peninsula. There's a shared grid, and the nuclear energy power plant is going to be able to produce electricity for all of for that can be sort of transferred and used in other parts of the GCC as well. And so this has different kinds of political consequences as well, because it's participating in the making of a sort of a larger infrastructure project across the Arabian Peninsula. In terms of the sort of, there's very different kinds of opinions about what nuclear energy means. We all know about sort of its dangers and what it might create in the region. But at the same time, some climate change activists are very pro-nuclear energy, thinking that this is okay, this is the only way in which we can sort of work against fossil fuels. So it would be I'm not sure exactly how the future of the sort of how it's going to impact the future of renewable energy development in the region, but that would be one thing that would be interesting to look at, whether sort of the presence of a nuclear energy power plant is going to mean that there will be less investment or less interest in sort of solar and wind and other kinds of renewable energy power stations. In terms of the urbanism of Masdar City, I think it's I think the model of an eco-city was more prominent across the world in the sort of in the years 2006, 2007. Songdo is another example that was very highly publicized and written about. And these kinds of there still are master plan cities like this being built around the world, but the sort of I'm hearing less and less the idea of sort of thinking of these cities as commodities that can be packaged and sold to different parts of the world. So, for instance, one of the ideas that was important while the Masdar City project was being built was that Masdar City, once it was completed, once it could be exported as a whole to other parts of the world, and because it was being built in the desert, and because the idea was that since we'll be able to build it in this environment, we can build it anywhere. It's a sort of a decontextualized project that can mushroom in all parts of the world, right? And can be sold as a commodity. I'm hearing this kind of imagination of an eco-city being transported, again, as a spaceship to different kinds of frontiers, less and less. But that doesn't mean that some of the sort of the conversation on how architecture and urbanism can confront climate change I think it's had an impact on the conversation on how architecture and urbanism can confront climate change, for sure.
Great. Well, before we open it to the Q&A, can you just give us a sense of, firstly, how you think the state of the field around these topics, particularly focused on the Gulf, has changed, and if you think it is in a kind of a stronger place now than when you started, and a sense of the field?
I mean, I think for sure. I mean, there's so much great work coming out of the Gulf these days. I mean, I was chairing the dissertation award, Gulf Prize, and last week we read all the dissertations that were submitted, and it's incredible, the quality of the work. And I think I don't think this was necessarily the case, say, 20 years ago. So this is, I think, a really important development to note. But at the same time, I think there's a sort of it's interesting to look at the kind of the nature of the work coming from not only the Gulf, but from the Middle East in general. You started your comments by saying how sort of unusual Spaceship in the Desert was, or how unusual it was to do research on environmental or technological questions in the sort of the early 2000s. Now that is becoming less and less so. There are more projects that look at infrastructure, urbanism, and sort of science and technology related issues in the region. Although the more dominant conversations in Middle East studies are also in the Gulf, I guess, were around sort of religion or gender issues or political conflict. Now, I think, although those issues continue to be important for the field, I think there's more interest in sort of concentrations on sort of like a science and technology, which was seen as being unusual, again, 20 years ago. So the science and technology studies in general has been a very sort of global north focused sort of discipline. And now I think we're seeing a change, and Middle East studies is playing a role in changing that, for sure, as more scholars working in the Middle East look at science and technology or environmental issues or infrastructural issues.
Well, and also as we're seeing how Middle East studies as a field is changing, also your own work is changing and expanding. Could you give us a sense of what your latest project is, as I understand, in Ghana, and its connections to Middle East studies, and how you're reinterpreting the field with this project?
I mean, I guess one thing I should also say is that now there's an important sort of theological conversation happening in anthropology where we're sort of thinking about how should we feel this that we can actually draw boundaries around, and or is it something that we can leave behind or something we always carry with us? And so it's important to sort of also recognize the globality, the inevitable globality of all the issues that we're looking at. If I'm studying climate change or energy issues or energy infrastructures in Abu Dhabi, those issues are actually affecting my life here in Houston very much so. And maybe going off of that, I mean, if we start with that kind of premise, and if we believe in that globality to begin, I think it's very easy to sort of trace the relations between different fields. Say, now I'm doing research in Ghana, looking at electricity production there. The reason I went there was because I wanted to study a context where, I mean, in Abu Dhabi, so much of what I looked at was about sort of what are we going to do in the future when we run out of oil, or what are we going to do in the future when we're dealing with the sort of the devastating effects of climate change, and that kind of future-oriented thinking was a big, in a way, it was a big luxury for people at Masdar City, and it allowed them to experiment with a lot of different kinds of projects, and trial and error was made possible. And in a sort of in a way that didn't necessarily impact everyone that was, you know, in a drastic way. I wanted to see a context. I mean, I wanted to see what happens if you don't have this kind of, if the temporal scale is very different. So if you actually have to deal with immediate problems in electricity provision or climate change or energy production in general. So what happens in a context where there's scarcity in the present, and this is not a sort of a future imagination of a future scenario, and that's why I started looking at these floating power plants that a Turkish company produces and leases to different places around the world, mostly in the global south. They're very popular in sub-Saharan Africa, and their largest project is in Ghana. And what they do is in places where there's a problem electricity provision, the floating power plant, I mean, it's a ship that has generators on it, sort of goes and anchors in a port and gets attached to the electricity grid of the country with high frequency cables and starts producing electricity for that country. So in Ghana, the ship that I'm looking at produces now about 1/4 of Ghana's electricity. It's hard to use proportions like this because, of course, every day there's different levels of electricity being produced, but still it's a very big actor. And once I went there to start seeing how the ship works, I started learning more about the sort of the other kinds of electricity generation projects in the country. Actually, one of the other major players is an Emirati energy company that's producing electricity for Ghana. And the project slowly turned into a critique of sort of the conversation on energy transitions, where there's a sort of a very modernist understanding of how renewable energy and clean technology is around the corner, how there's a sort of a very sort of a linear sense where, okay, now we're relying on fossil fuels, but in 50 years from now, we're going to be relying on renewable energy. Sure, the proportions of what kind of energy what kind of electricity generation we rely on does change, but that doesn't mean that there's actually a transition that we've actually left behind the former sources of, say, former fossil fuels behind, let's say. So in Ghana, what I'm seeing is, I mean, I'm calling it energy accumulation, where there's a sort of a multiple layers of electricity production being sort of accumulated and being gathered. And one of the things that's really interesting there, again, in sort of responding to the energy transition conversation, is that actually until the year 2000, Ghana relied only on hydropower for its electricity production. So it was fully renewable. It's only in the last 20 years that its electricity production has become, now it relies on 2/3 of its electricity production comes from fossil fuels. So when I talk to experts and decision makers in Ghana, they say maybe we're transitioning in reverse, but which I think helps me understand how problematic that linearity is, because it doesn't actually match the sort of the lived reality in a lot of places around the world. I mean, I think including in the global north, but also but especially in places like Ghana and the global south. So, so the project has, I mean, I think my interests in temporality and infrastructure and energy and climate change issues remains the same, but so I didn't necessarily see doing research in Ghana as a sort of going to sort of like a place that sort of so much as like an exotic place or anything like that. It's actually very much part of the existing networks of energy and climate change expertise that I've been part of, which I'm now following in Ghana.
Great, thank you. Shan, I think I hand it over to you to do the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. So I do have some questions. I'll go ahead and get started with those from the audience. So we have a first question. Have there been other countries in the region that pursued similar projects like this before or since Masdar City? And I would maybe also ask you to talk about some of the other sort of thematic cities, maybe like Education City and this, you know, this sort of phenomenon of these specialized cities in the Gulf in particular, and if there are similar sort of you know, class dynamics that you could pull out of those as well to compare. Yeah, I mean, there's other questions, but I think I'll let you answer that one first.
Sure. I think it's important to sort of also think about how the other bubble cities, that sort of these other segregated sort of very sort of business specific cities in the Gulf were important in sort of inspirations for a place like Masdar City. So for instance, one of the examples that people often gave in talking about Masdar City was a media city in Dubai. And they said, you know, in building media city, people, they just, you know, gave a building for free to CNN. And once CNN arrived, all the other media companies arrived. And now Media City is a sort of a bustling hub and it's doing really well. And so why can't we use the same model for renewable energy and clean technology in thinking about Masdar City? So, and I think this is not even, I mean, I think this is not even sort of the last sort of 20, 30 years in Dubai have been influential in thinking about these kinds of forms, but I think this history goes back even further to the sort of the oil town, the company town, that was so important to the sort of the urbanism in the region. And there's great work on this and on the Gulf already. So, and I think the model of the company town, the oil town, has been quite influential in building, giving inspiration to the UAE and to other Gulf countries to build these kinds of segregated, specific business-focused cities. And Masdar City just becomes one more of these. I mean, Masdar City is right next to the Formula One tracks. And initially people said, oh, this is such a big paradox. How could the environmental sort of eco-city be situated right next to the Formula One tracks? But in a way, they were all seen as a big economic diversification plan. So if you look at it from that perspective, yeah, Formula One tracks are doing one thing, they're performing one role in sort of extending economic diversification. Masdar City is doing another thing. So of course, if you think about their sort of carbon emissions, their goals are very different. But if you look at it from the perspective of Abu Dhabi's decision makers, they look very similar. And other examples of cities like this, I mean, now the most recent one that was talked about quite a lot in the last 2 years is NEOM in Saudi Arabia, which is sort of an upgrade of the Masdar City model in some ways, because it's going to be run by robots, it's going to be relying on Bitcoin, and I'm not, you know, I'm not exactly sure what the city is going to look like, but the sort of the imagination of a sort of I mean, technology intensive urban environment where people are not going to, where robots and other kinds of automation technologies are going to take on a lot of the sort of the everyday responsibilities, is definitely still there. But it'll be interesting to see how these ideas also develop after the sort of the current financial crises and the medical crises that we're experiencing.
Excellent, thank you. Can you describe the role that you think urbanism ideally should play in addressing climate change. So there's obviously drawbacks that you've talked about. Is there something that you would envision that would be an ideal sort of role for urbanism to play in that development? And then do you think that your analysis of the shortcomings of these sort of mere technological solutions affirm the importance of a broader approach that addresses the entire social contract, such as the Green New Deal?
Yeah, I think those are both great questions. I mean, for sure, there's, I think, a need to sort of rethink the social contract and rethink how we engage with climate change issues more broadly. And you could say the same thing for urbanism. I mean, as I was describing, I mean, if you think of your city as sort of specific nodes that address different kinds of issues, say like you have the media city, you have the Formula One city, you have the Masdar City, then it's very hard to actually think of an integrated sort of urban model where you respond to climate change related concerns in a sort of a broad and detailed manner. So say a context like Masdar City generates is a showcase where there's trial and error around different kinds of clean technology projects without being too concerned about how those projects are applied across the board, right? So yeah, across social contract. And so, and I see these kinds of, again, these kinds of engagements with, say, urbanism or even just everyday consumption habits everywhere. I mean, if you think about things like plastic bags, say, it's impossible for us to imagine not using plastic bags, so we've replaced them with biodegradable plastic bags. But these kinds of ideas around sort of these categories that have emerged and that have become so significant to our everyday lives are, I think, important to question in themselves and to sort of actually address it as part of that social contract, as part of what those categories do for us as sort of as humans, and what kinds of impacts do they have in the world, in the non-human world, in the sort of and in climate change mitigation adaptation projects more broadly. And so if you think about urbanism in that scale, I think it's a question of sort of what one of the things students at Masdar said over and over, for instance, as they were engaging with a project like Masdar City, was who is going to actually be able to afford something like Masdar City? Who are the sort of the people who are actually going to be the beneficiaries of this kind of grand and large scale project? And some of them said, you know, that someone has to invest in this kind of clean tech project, that's expansive clean tech project. Think about the car. Someone invested in the car, someone developed the car, and now it's spread all around the world. And but I don't know if this is a kind of approach that we could have with climate change mitigation and adaptation projects, especially seeing how drastically we need these kinds of measures right now. So I think the practicality of these measures is going to be the most important one, and the sort of the broad applicability of these measures, rather than the sort of the rather sort of trying to to keep the status quo intact. We're actually going to have to think about what are the things that we have to change and that we have to let go in imagining a sort of a future for. In imagining a sort of a future, basically. Yeah. So I think the main concern, again, with Masdar was the sort of the keeping the status quo intact, and I think that's the thing that needs to be questioned. And the things like the Green New Deal are trying to do exactly that.
Excellent, thank you. So in a place like Masdar, where there's such an enormous degree of automation and technology, where does the worker, sort of an average sort of laborer, fit into something like that if it were running, right? You talk about the man with the brush sort of filling this niche role because the technology sort of failed, right? But where would workers, if the technology was running correctly, where would, you know, low wage sort of normal workers exist in that hierarchy? And then also, can you speak a little bit about to what extent there are ideas of urban development that were developed in other cities that were taken and applied to the setting in Masdar City? Go ahead.
I think that this has been written about across the Gulf, and where the sort of the role of the low-wage worker is not necessarily as part of these cities, where the low-wage laborers live in labor camps outside the city, are driven by buses in the morning to their workplaces, and are driven back when the workday is over. And they don't necessarily get to use any of the technologies that are available in the city. So, for instance, the PRT, the image I have up now, was a sort of a system that connected the Masdar City parking lot to the Masdar Institute building, but there was also a shuttle bus, so for the laborers to take. So the laborers were not allowed to take PRT. And one reason why the PRT existed as a sort of a technology was so that the city could eliminate the driver. So an automated pod car was celebrated because it would eliminate the sort of the need for the laborer to actually enter the city. And so there's a sort of imagination of keeping the low-wage workers outside and minimize their impact in the sort of the everyday workings of the city. And that's why automation projects become important. And the solar panel issues, actually, it's not a failure of the technology. I mean, this is what's used all over the world. It's not, I mean, this is, so maybe in the sense that, yes, maybe there'll be a technological sort of fix to that will eliminate the sort of the man with a brush, but it is the reality. I mean, it's still, it's a sort of a method that's used widely in order to sort of keep solar panels clean. And so, so I think the sort of the main principle is across the board in regards to every form of infrastructure at Masdar City was to sort of minimize the presence of the worker, was to minimize the sort of the visibility of the worker as an inhabitant. And it was unthinkable at the time for the workers to actually live in the city. So I'm not sure if there's been, I mean, again, the city's not being developed now in the way that it was imagined in the master plan. But that wasn't definitely not a priority for the developers, although many people on site expressed criticism about this. And another example is I mean, in response to your second question, and I'll respond to this from the perspective of, say, Foster and Partners architects that were responsible for designing the city. So for the architects, I think it was very important to find a context to respond to, although this is imagined as a decontextualized project that can exist anywhere. And what they did was to sort of go around and look at sort of different formal examples of cities across the Arabian Peninsula or different parts of the Middle East, and see what are the kinds of formal principles that have been applied in these geographies that we can sort of use as inspiration or as examples. So one of the, although there were a lot of references to, say, the old cities of Aleppo or different old cities in North Africa, one of the examples that stood out the most was Shibam in Yemen. And I think I have an image of Shibam here, one second. Here, this is an image of Shibam, and this is an image that was taken by a National Geographic photographer. And this image circulated quite widely in presentations about Masdar City. And I have in the book, I have this section where I talk about sort of how one of the audience members who watched the presentations by the architect said, have you ever been to Shibam? Have you ever seen it? Have you ever experienced it firsthand? And no one in the audience, including the architects, had actually been to Shibam or had seen it. And they said, you know, it's impossible to go there these days, but one day I would love to visit it. I think what's so interesting about that comment now, after the sort of especially after the war in Yemen, is to see how that impossibility of visiting Shibam is actually what creates Masdar City as a possibility. So there's actually zero-sum sort of relationship there, and while I was working on the book, what I thought was, okay, actually, one political way, a political sort of strategy that image helps sort of strengthen is to say, the Middle East, as we know it, is somewhere in history. It's in the past. And Abu Dhabi is actually in the future. So it creates this kind of strange temporal, again, a very linear sort of temporal understanding where all these examples constitute historical precedents where, which enable Abu Dhabi to sort of generate a certain kind of centrality for all of its projects and to place itself in the future of the Middle East and to place all these places, to place all these cities that act as historical precedents in a sort of in an unapproachable history and an unapproachable geography. So it is, and I think this is actually, it is a conscious political sort of move on the part of the people who celebrate these presentations.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I have one, I think, maybe two last questions. I'll give you the first one and you can answer, and then if we get another one. And this audience member is asking about the sort of early modern techniques of cooling that were developed in the Middle East and then later sort of spread elsewhere, right? So the lattice windows, the very tall construction of buildings to shade areas, and whether any of those sort of indigenous technologies were imported into something like Masdar City, or whether there was thought given to that beyond just the aesthetic sort of value.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's the vernacular sort of forms of cooling were embraced, and there was the sort of mashabia, the lattice windows, and also the wind tower. I think I have a image of the. Here you can see some of the. No, maybe. Here you can see the lattice windows here, and the sort of these are the windows of the dorm rooms. But the imagination was that these vernacular technologies would be combined with sort of a very high-tech sort of development, and they would become, although they would retain some of their formal sort of value, they would transform into something else. And there's also, I should have an image of the, maybe I have an image of the wind tower here somewhere as well. Yeah, sorry, but you can see the lattice windows a little bit better. But there's a sort of interest in bringing those technologies in for sure. But there's also I think, but again, I think that's part of the same kind of political project that I was talking about earlier in relationship to Shibam. So it's not only a sort of, okay, what are the sort of the cooling techniques that we can use here that will have efficient sort of results, but it's also part of this genealogy making project where you draw these kinds of figures from different parts of the Middle East and create this kind of central hub where all of those technologies can exist, where sort of the future of the Middle East can be sort of laid out. And there's a conversation. I mean, I try to follow sort of conversation on air conditioning quite widely around the world, and there's a conversation around sort of the role of these kind of vernacular cooling strategies in thinking about minimizing air conditioning use around the world, and I think they are going to play a role. But there's also sort of other kinds of less visible, less spectacular forms of technologies that need to be applied in the Gulf. For instance, insulation is something that's really undervalued in the Arabian Peninsula, and that could definitely have a major impact on reducing electricity use on cooling, because right now of all the electricity that's produced in the Arabian Peninsula, 70% is used on air conditioning, and so there's definitely a need to cut that down, and insulation might be actually a more sort of immediate sort of strategy in doing that. But there's definitely sort of a conversation on the role of these kinds of vernacular technologies in thinking about sort of cooling in the future.
Excellent, thank you. And we have one final question. So if Masdar is one urban imaginary that has shortcomings in that it produces an exclusionary bubble, How might you imagine a different kind of intervention from this idealized greenwashed version?
Great question. And I wish I had a very good answer for that question, but unfortunately, I think what I can say is that, so I think there are certain things that I think that need to sort of be kept. I mean, that we need to sort of foreground from the Masdar City project. One is that there was no conversation around whether climate change exists or not. So if you think about it in comparison to the American context where we're having these kinds of conversations, it shows Masdar City is a very good example of how actually those conversations might not necessarily be so relevant. And then second, I think it's exemplary in the kind of investment that it has in sort of climate change and energy related technologies, which is also a kind of conversation that is not always, that's not a conversation we can take for granted in the US context today. And those are, I think, and these were conversations that were happening in 2006, 2007, and now 14 years later, they haven't necessarily become mainstream, which is, I think, very surprising, that there is still a debate on whether we should rely on science in understanding the world. So I think those are takeaways that I think are important in sort of reflecting on Masdar City, and which is one of the reasons why I was sort of wary of thinking about it as a sort of immediately as, okay, let's just name it a failure and move on. That's actually, maybe it's important to sort of look at the takeaways that we should preserve from this experiment, and see it as generative of something else, see it as a productive thing, and not necessarily as a sort of a total, like a breakdown of some sort, right? So, yeah, I don't know, leave it at that for now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you both. This has been really wonderful.
Yes. Thank you, Günel and Deen, for a really stimulating conversation. Shana for so efficiently moderating our questions and keeping us exactly to 1 p.m. And a big thank you to Christian and Elad for all their work putting together the logistics for this event. Just to plug, our next film and lecture series event is October 22nd. We'll be joined by Rosie Bashir and Ahmed Khanna to talk about Rosie's new book, Archive Wars, at noon. So please join us for that. And thank you again for such a great conversation.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.